Welcome to the Rating Room, the podcast where we unpack everything NatHers. I'm Brian Haynes, and alongside me are my co-hosts Matthew Graham and Andrew Hooper. Together we dive into the technical, the practical, and sometimes the controversial aspects of the NatHers scheme and everything in between. Whether you're an accredited assessor, a building designer, an energy efficiency specialist, or just trying to navigate the ever-evolving world of residential energy performance in Australia, then this is the room where the ratings get real. Let's get into it.
So this episode is going to be a little bit more Victorian centric. We discussed in a previous episode about Victoria having specific rules and regulations, particularly Practice Note EE-04 pertaining to additions and alterations. So we're going to dissect that tonight. We have with us a special guest, Sean McDonnell from Red Textas Consultant Building Surveyors in Brighton. He's going to join us. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, guys.
I have known Sean, Red Textas for about 15 years, and Sean's always been one of my go-to building surveyors whenever I've got questions. So always appreciate your feedback. Sean, please introduce yourself and do a blatant plug for Red Textas.
Yeah. Well, I've worked at Red Textas since I started my university studies, so that was back in 2006. So I initially got into engineering and then threw in a commerce degree to make it even longer. So I, by chance, got a job at a building surveying firm. I had no idea what they did or what their function was or what happened, but I just by chance landed a job there. Took me 7 or 8 years to finish my course that I was doing, and then in that time I was pretty much, if I wasn't at uni, I was working at Red Textas, starting out just stamping plans, and back when you had the old hard copy sets of plans, stamping plans, admin side of things, and it kind of progressed as I went, and then made the decision at the end of finishing my course that I'd learned that much about building surveying. It's like my engineering was civil engineering as well, so which was a good background to building surveying essentially. And then made the decision to continue on the building surveying path and did some further studies, did a graduate diploma after that, to eventually then end up getting my inspector's rego. So I've had Inspector Unlimited and then Building Surveyor Unlimited as well. So I did it the long way, but it was, it's now, what's that, around 21 years. It's a job I enjoy. There's always challenges. It's never simple, but I've always had a bit of an engineering brain, and it kind of suits for a lot of the tasks involved as part of a building surveyor. At Red Textas, we have now 3 registered building surveyors. Actually, there's a 4th. One of our inspectors just got his rego too. We have a few full-time inspectors as well. We primarily do all our inspections mostly in-house, and then a fairly large admin team, including assistant building surveyors. So we've got around about 15 staff in the office, and then including a few students who share some jobs and do some admin as well. So we do a mix of both residential and commercial works. We do our biggest portion would be Class 1 dwellings, whether they're new dwellings, multi-dwellings, or renovations and extensions. We primarily do everything's custom built. We don't really deal with any volume builders, so they're all custom jobs, all bespoke. Every job's always a little bit different to the next one. We also do a fair few kind of shop fit outs. We do a few apartment buildings here and there. We don't generally get into any of the high rise space where we leave that to others. But we see a good mix, but it's probably 80 to 90% of Class 1s is what we deal with. We see from tiny little renovations through to very high end architecturals and pretty much everything in between. My role in business now, I'm an issuing building surveyor, so I act as one of the relevant building surveyor for a group of jobs. We share jobs around a little bit, but I primarily tend to deal with the higher end architectural jobs, our commercial jobs, the apartment buildings, and there's still some of the smaller renovations and that too, but mostly the higher end side of things. But have dealt with throughout my we kind of generally progress, starting with the smaller ones as you're learning, and kind of as you're starting to get the hang of it, moving up to the higher end stuff. So, we share a lot. We have a few, as I said, few registered building surveyors in our office, so there's always a lot of discussions going on, and also part of different groups externally where you're speaking to some other building surveyors and trying to get some ideas, external to your office. So there's always things we're adapting and learning and getting interpretations that are always different. So and also I note it with anything I say today will be generally my personal view. You could get a group of 5 building surveyors in the same room and you get 5 different answers for one question. So there's always a lot of interpretation that comes into things. And generally we don't tend to discuss the basic, easy things that we all agree on. So particularly for those kind of questions and the grey areas and you're going to get many different interpretations depending on their experience, who you speak to, how they read it, and a number of things, which sounds pretty similar to energy rating and energy raters and questions surrounding that as well.
How much of that collaboration with other building surveying companies are there? Because it seems like at one point in time you'll be doing something a certain way, and then every now and then, like in a group capacity, something will change, and every building surveyor that you deal with has decided that no, it needs to be done this way and things need to be changed. It's almost like there's a collective change in understanding that happens all at once. Is that something that happens?
I wish we were all that collaborative.
Like a hive mind.
There tends to be more. It can come through different avenues, but there tends to be, like, say, there was a ruling on something, like it might be a building appeals board ruling on something that has then changed minds, or there might be an interpretation that comes out even through. So there can be obviously case law things that affect things, but there can be direction from BPC. They often don't make blanket rulings, but there can be things that get discussed over time and interpretations that often out of case law, but no, it doesn't. I mean, there's also like your Australian Institute of Building Surveyors that look into certain things and run different seminars. So often things can come from a seminar as well, which BPC runs seminars, so do AIBS. So often things can kind of get brought out at those things that suddenly puts it on people's radar as well. But no, it would be good if there was a bit more collaboration, because you can get a bit insular within your own office and not getting outside things. So we do as much as we can to try to get external feedback and views on different things. Yeah,
that's the aim of what we're doing here, obviously, to bring us all together and talk about things and get a general understanding of how everything works.
And plus, things seem to be constantly changing, so that also doesn't that adds extra things to it, and different things get brought to light as things change as well.
So with the current changes, actually the changes with NCC 2022 has probably been about 18 months now. Have you seen an increase in the specification or difficulty in actually trying to assess an energy rating with regards to what the insulation levels are, what the glazing specification and so on? Like how do you on-site determine that information? Are you relying on information from the builder or the certificate from the insulation installer? How is all of those types of things checked and observed and signed off on?
Yeah, well, obviously the whole of home has been an addition to your standard requirements we've seen beforehand. Part of the difficulty in our role is in terms of mandatory inspections we carry out. There's essentially after your frame inspection, there's generally only a final inspection after that. So we're not there to physically see you generally can't really see. We're not getting in roof spaces as well as part of our final inspection. So in terms of energy provisions, it's actually very limited what we check as the RBS. So often we're relying on statements, whether that's from declarations from builders. You're obviously getting your glazing certificates, insulation records, those kind of things. But it hasn't changed significantly between 6 and 7 stars. We haven't found from an occupancy perspective. Obviously, there's the extra whole of home side of things that has added to it. And then obviously the elimination of, using a tank or connected to toilets or a solar hot water system. But we try to have it clear for our inspectors of in our files of what's expected, what BCA are we under, so then they're knowing what to look for, as well as it having, clear in plans doesn't need a tank connected to toilets, because We still have a lot of jobs running now that are under your previous transitional provisions.
That's actually a really good question. You know, in 2026, what sort of percentage or proportion are we seeing of projects that are still going through under NCC 2019 compared to 2022?
Less now. It's kind of starting to run out. You're getting the odd ones here and there, but even ones with, say, you know, planning permits, you've usually got to start within 2 years. So you're starting to see it phased out a lot more. You're getting the odd job here and there, but it is starting to really push into that time frame expiring a bit. Like there's technically no time frame. Someone might have sat on a job for a few years, or there's no technical limitation, but often there's a bit of discretion that comes into that as well as to, and also what is considered substantial progress on a design and what can be accepted as well. For our purposes, because we don't really deal with volume builders, we don't have the challenges that they have on those jobs, whereas I know building surveyors who deal with those, they have to really deal with the new provisions a lot quicker. There seems to be a much quicker turnaround on those jobs, and they're dealing with the provisions a lot earlier than we may be, and we tend to lag a bit given we're dealing with jobs that can tend to drag out a little bit further.
Yeah, with regards to that, with regards to volume building, so they seem to, because they're all master designs, let's say, and the same design repeated, and all they really do is just tweak a few bits and pieces and so on. They actually, most building surveyors take it from the point of deposit, because the master design had actually been designed years earlier. So, you know, there's a lot of those still coming through now. Deposits were taken, but finance has taken a long time, or let's say the development took forever to get a permit on the block of land and those types of things. So we're still seeing probably, I'd say 20% that are still in NCC 2019. And like I said, we're April 2026 now. So it's still a fair few, but it will drop off very fast though. But we just haven't quite got to that point yet.
Yeah, we're finding it tapering. And then also, obviously, there was some other significant changes from our perspective that came in on top of just the energy rating. There's obviously the condensation provisions, which there's more to come as well in the next changes, but also the livable housing provisions has been very significant in designs as well. So they're kind of grouped together as the three main changes. There's some others in there too, but it's the main thing, and the date being the 1st of May 2014 is the essentially the cut-off date for these changes.
Mentioned about a whole of home. So for whole of home, are builders specifically referencing the whole of home requirements when they're, and presumably they're sending a letter saying that it's been built in accordance with the building permit? Is it just a blanket sort of statement, or is there anything specific to do with the whole of home?
Yeah, well, we generally ask, we don't generally ask for a letter from the builder to say it's all in accordance with the plans. There'll be some specific aspects we're looking at, one of them being energy rating. So we would generally ask for them to reference the energy report and the whole of home requirements. We have a lot of other provisions, obviously some in terms of cladding installation, particularly where there's been a performance solution, say for like an EPS cladding, that it's all been installed as per the requirements. So there's some extra requirements. So we do generally ask for fairly specific requirements, and each job's a little bit different to each as well in terms of what we ask for. But energy in general, energy report including the whole of home.
Yeah, so most of the time the builders haven't actually worked out what their heating or cooling unit is that they're actually putting in. So at the time of actually getting the building permit. So how do you then cross-reference what they've actually put in, like say, for example, the ACOP and the AER of the heater and the cooler versus what's on the documentation? Like surely you'd have to go through that at some point in time.
It's a good question. We generally do see that primarily as the responsibility of the builder to comply with what's been put in the report, and that any changes do need to be essentially, there's an onus on them to report any obligations, changes, which are often made throughout the project, obviously. Look, it is a newer thing, the whole of home, in terms of timing for us for houses being complete. It actually probably is a smallish portion of houses right now. Like new jobs, a lot of them are assessed under that at the moment, but they may not have been finished yet. So it is also something that's a work in progress for us as well. And there are always kind of things we're looking at in how can we improve our standards and make sure that these things are crossed off as they come up as potential issues, or if they have made changes.
Sounds like a good case for post-construction verification for an energy rater, don't you think?
Well, is there much photographic evidence? I mean, I'm sort of thinking about passive houses, relies on sort of, the whole process relies on sort of photographing as part of the documenting the journey. We've got existing homes, and for existing homes, again,
Lots of photos.
Lots of photos. Could
And
be 50
also
photos.
ESD for planning.
Yeah, so there's a lot more
provide
photographic evidence required, I believe, these days. It's this particular unit. It's so I'm wondering, is there any of that, or maybe that's something that could be introduced?
Yeah, from our side, generally not, because we, in terms of responsibilities under the Building Act, we obviously have our mandatory inspections that are carried out at those mandatory stages. Certain things that we need to look at each of those inspections. But the key one from an energy perspective being the final inspection from our side of things. It's prescribed in the Act that it's not us issuing an occupancy permit or certificate of final inspection isn't evidence that the building is compliant. It's only evidence that the building is suitable to occupy. So in terms of our responsibility and checks, it doesn't go as far for the builder to give us evidence of every single aspect of the building is compliant with the Act. So
it has a hot water service. It just doesn't matter what that model number is.
Well, that's where it can be open to interpretation of what is. I mean, obviously, if there's practical things that we're checking and can see, particularly around, safety is a big aspect of occupancy permit. Is the stair compliant? Is it non-slip? Is the balustrade compliant? Those kind of things that can be physically measured and looked at. It's a little bit more open to interpretation. How is a building not suitable to occupy because it is slightly lower energy? Yeah, the hot water service isn't as efficient as it was supposed to be, but it obviously is the builder's responsibility to make sure they comply with the energy report. But there's also a good question of where do you draw the line of what's a change that is a material change? When do we have to go back to the energy rater for some clarification? Does a minor change to a window, is it worthy of going back to the energy rater? That's another point I was going to ask. If you don't mind me bringing that up now.
Well, it may change from 7 stars to 6.9 stars. You don't know. So it's always good to
that
quantify.
0.1 of a star could mean the difference between thermally broken and non-thermally broken windows. So there's quite a financial impost on the client because of something like that as well. All these things start to add up. You've got 5.1 of a star items that aren't looked at, and suddenly you're at 6.5, not 7. So,
but there's a particular building inspector who's very prominent on TikTok and Facebook, and he's often saying that any change, any deviation from the building plan, that the Act requires new documentation. Where does that sort of start and finish? Is it that black and white that every little, he talks about if a cladding changed, it has to have new documentation. And this is probably getting into the building regulations rather than energy rating, but it then extends to energy rating because if they change the cladding, what effect did that have? If it changed, the fractional size of a window, what change did that have? So where do you draw the line?
That's a good question because it is open to interpretation. There's always going to be a degree of some changes that's not exactly as per the plans. There's also challenges too that when we issue an amendment to approve changes, you're not supposed to issue an amendment for changes that have been made already as built changes. So similar to when we issue building permits, we can only issue a building permit for proposed works, and that flows through to amendments that we can only issue amendments for things that are proposed. So there can be different ways of dealing with things. If we get there and something is changed, we're not necessarily allowed to prove an as-built change, but there might be queries surrounding that. There might be some form of enforcement that is another way for them to deal with it, such as a direction of fix or a building notice or a minor works order. But some of those might be too heavy-handed for a very minor change that isn't a material change as such. But that's always open to interpretation. And often if it's in doubt, we can see some significant changes. There's often a judgment call that has to come. Do they have to go back to the energy radar? Do they have to go back to, the engineer, depending on the change? Multiple things. And you're going to have more sensitive areas too, such as a cladding change for a non-DTS compliant cladding, such as EPS, which isn't compliant, needs a performance solution. If they've changed manufacturer or they've added it when it wasn't approved in the first place, so or if they just changed to one metal cladding to another that's covered by DTS provisions. So they're all things that get weighed up.
So have you guys ever done rectification works as far as the house has been built or the renovation extension has been done, or let's just say a garage has been turned into a habitable space, no building permit has been issued, no certificate of occupancy, and somehow it's on the council radar and they've been asked to get a building permit, and you do the energy efficiency assessment on it, it doesn't comp up at all, and the building surveyor still passes it because none of those actual items relate to, like what you were saying before about fire or somebody's going to hurt themselves or die or something like that. It's just not high on the radar or high on the scale of things that are really going to cause a problem with the house. I've seen that a lot of times. So, it's quite disconcerting, actually.
Look, I've seen it from both ways. I've had that scenario on some projects, and on other ones I've had a building surveyor absolutely adamant that the owner did the dodgy knowingly and they have to rectify works. I've seen comments saying that the roof has to be pulled to get in under it, flat roof or something like that, to ensure insulation's applied. I don't think it's a blanket statement to say it's overlooked. I see it both ways. What's your experience in that sort of thing, Sean?
What can be difficult with illegal works and council enforcement is that there's no prescribed process that councils must deal with in terms of, like, yes, there's building notice, building order, there's legislation for that, but there isn't a formal process in the Building Act or regulations that says council must cover ABC, like a building permit that's much more prescribed in the process. So you do find when there's building notices issued by council, it's very much open to their discretion and what they want, and you'll find that different councils have a way different perspective than others. Some will insist on way more onerous requirements. Other councils might be way less in many aspects in terms of whether it's fire rating, Part 5 siting issues with setbacks and heights surrounding those issues, fire safety, energy. They probably use some discretion in some cases. Say if it's a garage converted to a bedroom, they might have kind of Reg 233 in mind of going, well, there's a bit of discretion with that anyway. Energy's not too high on our radar. But you might have others that do insist on that. There'll be engineering reports. There'll be trying to certify the as-built structure, whether there's any new footings, slabs, things like that come into play. But it's very open-ended, and some councils are known as being much more difficult than others to satisfy requirements from in many different facets.
So occupant safety first before occupant comfort.
Generally, that's usually in terms if they were going to order it. Often your fire safety, your setbacks and heights, they rank pretty highly as well. But yeah, the energy probably isn't on the very top of the list, particularly when you're looking at something that might might be a risk to them because you got someone sleeping in there, there's no smoke alarms, the wall's not fire rated. So they're often trying to deal with the urgent life safety matters first.
Can I ask a follow-up question? You spoke about the mandatory inspection. Put you on the spot a little bit. It's okay. What are your thoughts with additional mandatory in sort of inspection points? Other countries have a lot more than what we have here. They can have more than double the number of mandatory sort of inspections, and also energy efficiency also tends to feature a little bit higher. I'm sort of thinking of maybe in America, Los Angeles, I think they have sort of, more than 10. And a lot of those are to do with energy efficiency. What are your thoughts on sort of maybe adding a few more?
Well, they have been on the government radar for a while. Energy, I don't believe, was higher on the priority. There's the ones that they're looking at are, and they still might come in because there's still proposed changes at the moment. They're looking at more, say, structural and waterproofing matters in that regard. One they're looking at is a very common issue is after we do our frame inspection, a lot of trades come in afterwards, hack things out. So the frame was compliant at one point, and then particularly often mechanical ventilation, those kind of things, bigger openings, hacking out the frame. And so that's on the radar of a post-services install frame inspection. Waterproofing's been the other one that's a hot topic. I agree with the post-services installation. I think that should be, it's supposed to be the builder's responsibility, but and look, they're not all trying to do the wrong thing and might miss things, but I think it is an important point to look at.
When I hear Andrew say things like safety before comfort, I think, maybe we could just have all the safety things in there and then say, right, we've got those covered. Now we'll put in a few that have
next. Yeah, so
that's right.
They're trying to tick some extra boxes. The other one is waterproofing. But in my opinion, I think it would open an absolute can of worms for us as the building surveyor to take on liability that we're not responsible for, because you're looking at bathrooms and balconies. It can be hard to inspect. It gets pretty complex in terms of what is compliant and is it compliant at the time. But my biggest issue probably is what happens after you inspect that and trades walking over it, penetrations to the membrane that was there. And then we're going to end up as ones that are liable for, you inspected it. Why is this balcony leaking? So I have concerns with us being dragged into that.
And I'm not envious of your professional indemnity.
And that's already
that's right.
There's only limited insurers in the market.
So, Sean, when you're looking through a NatHERS certificate, or assuming that you are looking through a NatHERS certificate, are there common errors that you spot or anything like that? Can you guys tell whether something's wrong? I'm sure, we can look through it and we can dissect it and we know exactly what's wrong compared to what we can see on the plans and so on. But do you guys go into that detail?
Some common areas would probably be surrounding materials and what's written on there. Obviously, deep into computations isn't the side of things that we can assess as building surveyors. But if you're looking at some basic things like floor type, suspended, is it timber floor, is it a concrete slab? You see some errors sometimes. Another area would be other material changes, such as they initially rated it with some EPS and then they change it across to Hebel or something like that. That's going to affect the report. My comments mostly on what can be lacking in a report is having a clear summary of requirements. What can be difficult is often you can make your way through that report and see generally what's there, but also with the provisions in the BCA that ask for additional requirements in addition to just the 7-star whole of home report. There's those additional requirements that may not be clear to those involved, including designer, and where we're looking at slab edge insulation and some of those aspects that come in. In my opinion, that reports could be a lot clearer as to these. Here's a clear list of the summaries that that are not just from the notice report, but also include in any additional requirements.
Yeah, so with those summaries that are provided on top of the certificate, there could be a lot of human error in those as well. So it's best to refer to the actual certificate itself. I mean, do you guys have when you signing contracts on a house and there's some clauses in those contracts that say what comes first in a hierarchy of things that could actually be wrong? Is it the plans? Is it the contract? Is it specification? Those types of things. Have you guys got any documentation where you put a hierarchy of where to look on your documents, and your actual cover sheets or documents that you put together could actually maybe slightly off for human error?
Yes, just a very brief statement. So on mine, I'll provide a covering letter with the certificate first and foremost. So that will break down all the inclusions I expect to see in a job. Whether anyone can read the certificate or not, here's the list of inclusions. And then we'll go into the additional information as you mentioned. Argumentatively, that's deemed to satisfy and maybe not something the energy rater has to do, but we put it on for sake of clarity so there's no confusion. But yes, at the very start of all this, we'll say the certificate takes precedence, followed by my covering letter. And I won't stamp a set of plans if there's any contradiction anyway. So it's really a case for me to ensure the documents are correct and aligned. And yeah, look, I make mistakes from time to time. It happens. I got an RFI from your office today asking for something on an elemental report. It wasn't anything major, but there was something that just needs that box ticked to ensure that it's all aligned. And clearly you read the report, or your office read the report to see that there might have been a discrepancy there. But yeah, look, it's just simply a very brief statement saying this is the order, but I don't go in depth on it.
Yeah, I think it's just good for the building surveyor and the builder, the architect, everybody to actually understand how to read a NatHERS certificate, because these discrepancies do happen. We get a lot of other energy raters reports through our office, and I'm forever seeing mistakes like that. It's like a cut and paste of a cover sheet over and over again, and it can be very wrong if you just followed what the energy rater actually says. Like, you really need to know how to read that certificate properly. Now, not necessarily saying that you need to know every part of it, but like you said, what the insulation levels are, what the window specification is, what the construction material types are. I think that would be the minimum understanding on that actual NatHERS certificate.
It sounds like I do similar to what Andrew does. I have a sort of separate report. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg. Something has to come first so that my client knows what to incorporate on the drawing set. So I provide a preliminary that doesn't have a NatHERS certificate, that is effectively a sort of like a specification. It's like a thermal specification saying that these are all the requirements that I need, and it's very clear up front that that result is predicated on that specification, and that all of that information needs to, at some point before I certify it, make its way onto the drawing set. So that's the most important thing for me. So the drawing set sort of comes first. My report's there just so that they know what to put onto the drawing set. And I don't mind where it is, as long as it's on the drawing set. It can also be an accompanying specification. I'm happy with that as well. I'll certify the relevant pages of the specification that have that sort of recognises that sometimes architects and building designers and drafting companies all work slightly differently, but it's very clear in my report that all of that information needs to be documented somewhere before I'll certify it. Once I certify it, then the NatHERS certificate is sort of, it overrides everything else, in combination with the drawing set. And even though I leave my sort of specification in there, I don't have to. I could remove it. I do leave it in there but there is a risk. It's a human element, isn't it?
That's
the
what
fact
it is.
that inconsistencies can creep in between the drawing set, your original specification, and then the NATHERS certificate. I'd just like to add for the NATHERS certificate that sort of you mentioned floors and floor coverings and a few things like that. They are actually sort of like a little bit harder to get wrong. But with walls, you can actually just model a brick veneer, but then have that actually described as a lightweight cladding.
It's whatever you want,
right?
Yeah.
Or wall type 1.
Yeah.
So there could be a complete mismatch of what's actually reported on the NATHERS certificate. And, as far as sort of like if you're just to read it, you just look at it and go, oh, okay. But it could be completely different. So,
But there's 100 things or 1,000 points of data entry in that NATHERS file that does not show up on that certificate. So there are 100 ways that you could, if you did not have ethics, that you could change that to make the rating better than what it actually is. And no one would be the wiser unless you were audited.
well, you can't see everything on there.
No, there's a whole heap missing.
Yeah, and at one stage, I believe that it was discussed that regardless of what you called the elements, it was actually going to transparently show the layers.
Well, do you remember
the materials
back in the day it did that?
It actually
It did.
very
It was
first
on there.
reports.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, it
it was
actually
going to do that
put
for
the section.
everything, I believe. All of the constructions, everything
should.
was just going to go straight back to whatever the layers were
Yep.
and all of the construction elements. So it didn't matter what you called it.
Yeah.
It was very clear what that breakdown was.
I find it bizarre that they actually had the sections in the certificate drawn and then removed them. I think that's a step backwards, if anything.
Well, I think there was a difference between first rate originally producing the certificates and then introducing the universal certificate where all the softwares had to match. It was more a software specific element that could be done, which then got removed. I mean, it'd be nice if all the softwares could do that. I don't know if they can. But yeah, I think that was the reason for the change more so.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Then to further complicate it, obviously interpreting the report in conjunction with Reg 233, which we'll obviously talk about, and in terms of getting clarity of what the construction requirements are, which could obviously be difficult from your perspective because you're subject to our Reg 233 discretion and what we will accept. At the same time, we want to have clear requirements of what is being included in the project. And, you might be subject to a building surveyor who may or may not accept something you thought was reasonable. So having those requirements clear can certainly be a bit blurred when it comes to Reg 233 and ensuring that that's factored in as well.
Yeah, I think we'll go through that as hard as we can in a few minutes to try and work out exactly what's happening with 233. Just one other question on this actual topic. Now, as a surveyor, do you play any role in reviewing the qualifications of the assessor that actually provides you the energy report?
Generally, and I'm aware that there are some reports that are non-accredited energy raters, and I have looked into that, but I don't believe I've ever seen a non-accredited report. I know the black and white version. Outside that, we generally wouldn't look too much further into when we're getting an accredited report from an assessor. And we see a lot of the same kind of names pop up on a lot of projects. But we generally wouldn't review much further because obviously there's an accreditation process that energy rater needs to go by and standards that they should be operating by. But it would be different if there were reports getting submitted that are non-accredited reports and could potentially be difficult to accept that as a building surveyor. But unfortunately, I haven't actually come across it in my time.
It's possible that in Victoria that we see less non-accredited assessments. I believe that there is a percentage of them that occurs nationally. Maybe 10%, something like that, 5-10%.
It's a pretty high percentage. Yeah.
I couldn't see a building surveyor taking on that responsibility of accepting an unaccredited assessment from an unaccredited assessor. I mean, isn't it your liability for doing that, because you're accepting that they actually know what they're doing and are competent at their job, even though it is an unaccredited assessment. Like that would be pretty foolish, I think.
Yeah, I think it could be hard to accept. On one arm, it's a slightly different area than other registrations we look at, and that we have to make sure in place, because obviously energy raters aren't accredited with BPC registration process, but there obviously is their own process to go through, and that's actually going to be more fragmented in different areas. Building engineers aren't under BPC anymore. Architects have their own. So there's a bit of separation but they're still generally considered registered building practitioners for building regulation purposes. But I think it would be difficult to accept one of those reports. There'd probably need to be something pretty concrete as to why they're not accredited, and just thinking out loud, it's not something I've come across.
Yeah.
Look, accredited energy raters have a fairly robust accreditation process. We are subject to audits. We have to maintain CPD, things like that. If we were to step out of that accreditation, it then open for everyone to do what they want to do. So, I mean, we look at accreditation as being a very positive thing.
Maybe from a building surveyor's perspective, knowing that an accredited assessor has professional indemnity insurance, I think, is an important one.
Yeah.
We were just talking about sort of liability before.
That's where I was going with it. Thank you.
And we don't, if it was not accredited, we don't necessarily have to. We'd have to probably make those inquiries. Do you have this? Why should it be accepted?
Can we see a certificate of currency?
Why haven't you got the accreditation? Those kind of things, which we don't necessarily have to question from an accredited energy rater.
So from your experience, whether there was mandatory national sort of accreditation, it wouldn't probably really make a difference, because you're not really seeing any non-accredited certificates coming across your desk. So I think that's interesting.
Yeah. That's good to hear, though.
It is, yeah, absolutely. Well, in Victoria.
Okay, well, we're here to talk about the practice notes, so let's get into that. We've got NCC, Building Regs, Building Act, Australian standards, referenced, non-referenced, and practice notes. Where does the practice note sit in terms of regulatory jurisdiction, in terms of regulation? Sometimes we come across a building surveyor who is adamant it must be followed black and white. Others say it's a guide. I've spoken with VBA in the past who have said, yes, it's a guide, but if it went to a hearing, you would have to justify why it wasn't followed. Things like that. How does it sit in the big scheme of things?
Yeah, because it's not legislation, as you're alluding to. I do see it more as a guide there that's to, there's a number of practice notes in different areas. They generally are there to elaborate on the regulations or the NCC clauses. As you did point out too, though, there is, when it comes to disciplinary hearings for building surveyors, there's some pretty broad clauses. There's even now the Building Surveying Code of Conduct and acting unprofessionally. And so things like that of, if say a guide, the practice notes which are issued by BPC, if they're blatantly ignored or or not considered at all, there could be an argument that you're acting unprofessionally, that you're not going in accordance with that guide. But in saying that, I think a lot of the practice notes aren't necessarily, they've been revised a lot of times, but they're not necessarily perfect. So there's a lot of areas in different practice notes that's open to debate, and often are debated with building surveyors, even down to your first practice note of when is a building permit required. It's incredibly complex, and they have some guidance to it. There's always room for discretion, because most practice notes don't tend to cover everything. And it's similar to, you've got even in your BCA Volume 1, there's a whole BCA Volume 1 guide as well. So that's how we similarly look at it. That's not legislation, but it is used for guidance and used as a source.
So it's sort of more like one of the terms in the practice note of the word reasonable. So if you're taking reasonable care to follow it, that's more or less what you want to see. Whereas you mentioned if you blatantly ignored it or refused to follow it, that would be a different situation. So taking a reasonable approach is the best way to go about it.
I believe so. And so there's always getting a balance there. But I think, look, the practice notes are generally, they're great. It's a good guide. You know, there's a lot of stuff in there that you just may not know yourself, particularly even like in energy rating. Like we obviously don't spend the time that you guys do on the software, the ins and outs, the assumptions that are in there, which we, without some of that guidance, would probably have no idea about unless we do further research into these things. So ultimately, the practice notes are a great idea. It's good to have them there to help explain some of these things that can get quite complex.
All right, let's get stuck into this Regulation 233. So I'm going to read this one verbatim straight from the Building Act. Regulation 233.2 requires that where the volume of proposed alterations combined with any alterations completed within the previous 3 years represents more than 50% of the volume of the original building, the entire building must be brought into compliance with the regulations. So from my understanding, if the renovation of the internal part of the house is more than 50% of the original volume of the house, then no partial compliance is allowed, existing or new. However, it then goes on, there's a sub-regulation 3. Now that states, despite sub-regulations 1 and 2, and subject to sub-regulation 6, the relevant building surveyor may consent to partial compliance of building work or an existing building with sub-regulation 1 and 2. So what that is basically saying, sub-regulation 3 can negate sub-regulations 1 and 2. Are we all of that understanding? I'm going to put this up on the screen as well, but are we all of that understanding that sub-regulation 3 negates 1 and 2? So it doesn't matter whether the 50% volume of the existing house is being altered, the building surveyor has dispensation over the existing and the new with respect to sub-regulation 6, which is the 25% extension of the house. It gets complicated. That's the problem. It does get too complicated.
Sean's what?
Sure. Can you explain Reg 233, please?
Yeah. So obviously we have a few different scenarios. Generally to start off, my reading of it is that it's starting out by saying once you hit that 50% alteration mark, it's expected you treat it like a new building. However, we have discretion on different parts depending on then the size of the alteration and the size of the extension and both. So you've got a few different cases that fall into different scenarios.
Now, I'll highlight a couple of things that will pop up on the screen very shortly. So there's one of these tables that talks about the alteration and percentage of volume, and we're talking about if it's less than 50% volume and it is greater than 25% increase in floor area, the dispensation is only available for the alteration. I actually think that's meant to say extension. Because the extension's the new part of the house.
I think it's meant to say no discretion. So and it depends if it falls in the 25 to 50%, the extension. But to almost go back a peg, there's a few different main scenarios. So if we look at starting at, if there's a very basic small extension, less than 25% compared to the existing, for example, 100 square metre house, you add on 20 square metres, we're under 25%. We have discretion with that new part, the less than 25%.
And the existing.
And generally any alterations within the existing. So I think that's the first part of our table I think kind of looked at. The larger end of the scale is if you did, say, a large addition and alteration where everything's over 50%. You might have a 100 square metre house, you add 70 square metres, you're already hitting that 50% in terms of alteration and extension, because often the extension is considered as part of the alteration. But then also any parts you're altering within the house as well, we have discretion, not with the new extension, our discretion only relates to the existing part of the building in that case, being over 50%. And then you have that one that's in between that you're discussing that is talking about if the extension is greater than we've got an alteration of less than 50%, but the extension is greater than 25%, then I don't see where we have any discretion in that case, because that one kind of falls in between and doesn't fit our criteria of greater than 50% alteration or less than 25% extension. So I struggle to see where we have discretion in that case. I think
there is a scenario. You're saying that there is a scenario out there where you would have to bring the entire house into compliance in that window, that certain window of extension and alteration.
No, if it falls in that 25 to 50% bracket, it means that 25 to 50% being extended, that new part must comply, but we don't actually have discretion with the existing house to make people do upgrades. So that's in that 25 to 50% bracket in between.
But your discretion is for them not to upgrade the existing part of the house.
Yeah, but we hit that case there in the middle where we actually we don't have any jurisdiction over that existing part of the house.
So it's back to the other one where it's greater than or under 50%. You're still going to give dispensation for the existing part of the house regardless.
Well, I think if it's greater than 50%, yes, and we have discretion with the existing house, but we can't require upgrades if you fall into that fairly simple example of let's say 100 square metres existing house, you add 35 square metres, so a 35% addition. We don't have discretion with anything essentially. We don't have, the new part has to comply. We don't have discretion with the existing. So it's not part of the scope.
So you're not exempting anything because there's nothing to exempt.
Yeah.
It's just make sure the new works.
You must comply in that case.
Yeah, but that's not going to work because you're doing an energy report on the entire house.
Yeah,
so there has to be
some practical issues from an energy rating. Look, I think because looking at the table, the situation I was just describing is essentially that one that says only available to the alteration. So less than 50% alteration, greater than 25% addition. We don't have discretion with that alteration. So I think if you're trying to do some interpretation in between, I probably get where there might be some views that we might have some discretion, because if you're weighing up let's go back to the less than 25% addition, we have discretion with the new part being added and any alteration inside. Then you go to the biggest case of greater than 50%, we have discretion with existing parts of the building, but you get that one that falls in between that kind of says, well, maybe we should have some discretion with the existing part of the house, but that's not what the regulations say.
So from a practical point of view, how do we deal as energy raters in that regards then, if in that middle point? I mean, as Brian said, we're bringing the whole house into compliance because that's sort of what we've got to do to demonstrate how the house works. Should the calculation method that's provided be brought to be functional from 25 to 50% as well?
Well, that probably leads on to that next section, because if I look at the calculation method mathematically, and trying to use my engineering brain, the formula that's in there, I know the practice note says this can only be used when it's less than 25%, but when I look at the formula and how it's looked at, it's essentially obviously a weighted average to figure out what should we achieve overall. But I think personally, looking at how it works from a maths perspective, that should be able to be used between 25 and 50%, because as long as you're not factoring in upgrades to the existing to get that your report to achieve that the star rating that comes out, I think you can only I think mathematically that says your new parts are achieving 7 stars. As long as you're only looking at upgrading essentially, as long as you're only factoring in the extension works and the values there without kind of artificially upping the total value by, say, putting in some insulation to the existing roof or something like that.
Okay, so if an assessor put it in the existing roof, because you're not mandated to be able to say that the existing has to be upgraded, the builder or homeowner could just ignore that completely anyway.
Yeah, from our perspective, yeah. Even though you will find in practice a lot of owners will want to do that while they're doing these works, and it's a pretty practical upgrade. It shouldn't necessarily be
But
documented.
you've always got
in the
someone
report.
trying to push the envelope and save a buck.
Yeah, of course.
Hadn't you already established with Tony Isaacs that formula would work in all cases regardless, even though it doesn't say it in the practice note?
Honestly, I don't remember. But even if we did, it would be the BPC or formerly the VBA that would decide whether that was the case, whether it was going to be implemented like that.
So moving on from that anyway, it does further state within the practice note that you can put a combination together as far as a performance solution goes to use that formula for different percentages regardless.
And there's the 2 formulas, obviously. There's one that says no internal alterations, and then there's the one that factors in some alteration as well.
So as long as the performance solution complies with A2, G2, you can use either of those formulas with any combination of extension or internal modification volume.
You can only use the one that has internal altered, the formula that has internal altered work if you have altered internal work.
You have to factor in that floor area into that.
If the floor area goes into it.
Yeah, that's the second part of that formula. But in this case, though, where you've got the differing internal volume changes to which
the volume has nothing to
trigger.
do with it. It used to be a volume-based formula. It used to be the linear relationship of the volume. This formula's changed. It's no longer volume-based. It's area-based.
I'm talking about the percentage of alteration for
That's
use
just-
of regulations.
So
That's just to
Reg
decide,
two-
that's
Reg
just to
two,
decide
three.
whether you can actually use it in the first place.
Yeah, that's
So they're 2 different things. One decides whether you actually can use the formula,
Mhm.
and then the other one is the sort of the application of the formula,
Yeah,
which is area-based.
But as a performance solution, surely that calculation could be used for any size project.
Yeah, it becomes
it's a
irrelevant.
performance solution. Wouldn't that be a reasonable basis of application?
Yeah, and I think you'd need to be able to show within that because in a lot of cases, even if you're talking the greater than 50%, a big addition scenario, you've still got to be able to demonstrate that, say, because say in a scenario where there's 100 square metre house, 100 square metre addition, we don't have discretion with the new part being added. Therefore, that must be able to be shown that achieves 7 stars, the addition, in a way. Obviously, you can then factor in alterations in the part of the house that are being altered, but we have discretion when it comes to the existing part of the house in that scenario, but the new must be demonstrated as being compliant. So I think there can be some complexities in showing that. Look, in practice, obviously I've discussed it. I think mathematically it can be used 25 to 50%. I've usually been pretty conservative in terms of following the practice note and saying, look, it should be addressed as a performance solution. But my personal opinion reviewing it and just looking at it from a numbers side of thing is I think there's a very strong argument to say it's not a performance solution, particularly in that 25 to 50% range. But I've still been taking the conservative approach and looking at it under performance in general.
So this is all based on the most current practice note that we're talking about. Now, the previous one, or it was actually maybe the one before that, there was no requirement to actually do it as a performance solution. It was actually as if it was elemental deemed to satisfy compliance. So it's only been reasonably recently, as in the last, say, 3 or 4 years, that we've been instructed to do it as per a performance solution. Now, but if you are doing...
I'm not sure about that. I think it just didn't have a label.
What do you mean by label?
We certainly got requests that if we ever used it, maybe in the last, however, 6-7 years.
Yeah, it's been years.
the building surveyors would say this is a performance
Yeah,
it is.
solution.
I think
treated
it's
as
always
one.
been one.
So
It just wasn't outlined.
okay, so maybe it was one of those things where the building surveyors get together and say, "Hey, we now need this as a performance solution." But with regards to that, however, if you do something as a performance solution, does that negate Regulation 233 because it is a performance solution?
You can have cases where both are being looked at, but in general, in most cases, you're either using Reg 233 where you have it, or you're doing a performance solution. But we do have some, and probably less in the energy field, but some other scenarios where, if we have some discretion where we're using that for either the new part or the alteration where we have discretion, but where the new parts must comply and they're not fully compliant, there might be a combination of performance getting tied in with Reg 233.
So when we do a performance solution for renovation extension, we reference and use Regulation 233 as justification for that performance solution. So we're doing a combination of both, which is basically what you've just said. But I thought, again, theoretically now against my better judgment, I just thought they were two separate items. Clear, well, maybe not.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's different ways you can assess a performance solution. One of the main ones is comparison to the deemed to satisfy provisions. So there's probably an argument that you're, saying that Reg 233 isn't arguably part of the deemed to satisfy provisions. It's more an exemption clause. Deemed to satisfy provisions are more, what's in the NCC itself. But I think it's still a relevant point to include in there in reference to that and what's expected, because, like you said, it can blur the lines a bit between performance and when Reg 233 gets looked at, and whether you have to look at just one of them or both of them at the same time. But like I said, it can be a combination of both.
As an example, if you had two rooms, and this was referenced in earlier practice notes, if you had two rooms side by side and you took out the dividing wall, it meant that both rooms would effectively become the total area of change. Now, I get that if it was like a bedroom, taking out a wall and it becomes part of a living space, so it's a change of use. But if you had like a dining room and a living room and took out the dividing wall, is that still change of use? Is that still saying that that whole floor area of both rooms is an alteration, which is what the previous practice note said?
Yeah, they leave it very open now, the RBS, to use professional judgment. But I believe, based on the examples that they have in there, that I don't, if you're, say, taking out the wall between the dining and the living area, which is pretty common now, even between kitchen and dining, I don't believe that whole area comes into play. You're essentially taking out, particularly where it's fairly minor works, you're taking out a wall, putting in a beam. That's the only actual part being altered. Probably arguably, if you're then fully fitting out the other areas, once then you start changing some windows, a bigger door in instead of the window, that area. But I wouldn't normally look at it from a suddenly incorporating both of those rooms in there.
Okay, I think that was sort of where I was heading with that question, because if you take out a wall and you're not changing the fabric, you're not changing the window, you're not changing the walls, you're not changing the ceiling, it becomes very hard to include that area or the volume calculation into the NATAS calculation and reach compliance without then also asking for dispensation on those existing fabric items that aren't touched. Yeah,
no, I agree. I mean, sometimes practically, if you're already over the 50%, doesn't matter how you calculate it if it's clearly over, but where it's making the difference of whether it's over a certain threshold, it obviously becomes a bit more
it's
vital.
removing that one wall, which can
one
suddenly
element.
go from 26% to 60%.
Yeah.
But if we're not counting that or not looking at it as intently, then it still enables the calculation to be used comfortably, I suppose, in my opinion.
All right, so there's two distinct methodologies of compliance. So we've discussed the two-house energy rating method, but we've also got the rating only the renovated house. Now, reading direct from the practice note, there's a specific paragraph that we all get hung up on, and we really have not had a good explanation of what it actually means. I've spoken to the VBA about it, and they said that they would go to the state building surveyor, Steve Baxis, to try and get resolution, but I haven't actually heard anything back. Now it says, rate the renovated house with sufficient improvements to the existing building fabric to achieve a rating of 7 stars. And here's the kicker. If a 7-star rating cannot be achieved, then the highest rating possible is to be demonstrated by the rating. What do we even make of that clause? Because, again, from my understanding, dispensation under Regulation 233 under no circumstances can be applied to the extension itself. So how can we possibly have a house rated under 7 stars and still comply with the elemental deemed to satisfy provisions in the NCC? It's not possible. So what do we all make of that clause? Because I just don't think it should or could even be there.
It seems to be adding an arbitrary application into regulation. It's the regs are, or the NCC said 7 stars, but now we've got a practice note saying, do the best you can. It seems to be a disconnect there somewhere.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know how I can accept that, how it can be quantified for me to accept it, because like you said, we use Reg 233 discretion where we have it, but it's fairly clear that when a new part has to be 7 stars, it has to be. It's not try your best and see what you can get. So I've had multiple energy raters bring that up, but I don't know how I'm supposed to accept that, and I don't believe it lines up with the expectations of the regulations, both Reg 233 and the NCC provisions.
So from your perspective then, the answer that you always give back to those energy raters are, no, I'm sorry, needs to achieve 7 stars?
Generally.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Or what about it needs to achieve 7 stars, but for parts of the existing building fabric? Where you can exercise your discretion.
With discretion, yeah. So obviously we'll
not
look
for
at
the new work.
discretion, not for obviously only where we have discretion.
So,
Yeah, but that is the point of that actual methodology, though. The whole thing needs to be 7 stars. It's simply, I can't get the house to 7 stars, so what do I do? So regardless of my application of Reg 233 and what percentage of the house that covers, I simply just can't get the thing to 7 stars. What do you do in a case like that? And I've had them before, that we just can't get them to 7 stars.
A 5 metre wide terrace house that has no north orientation and 2 stories either side of it. There's just no way you can get it to 7 stars. It's an impossibility. Is that the application that you can make a reasonable argument for it, or is it just out there?
I feel incredibly lucky, guys, because most of the projects I can get to 7 stars, and then the building surveyor will use their discretion for parts of the existing building fabric. It won't be 7 stars as certified. It would be 7 stars if they were to do whatever those changes were. Pardon me, to the existing building. So a few examples for that would be like, it could be like a cavity brick, right? So there's a lot of existing buildings that are cavity brick where, yes, it might be possible to actually add some insulation or rigid insulation to the inside or to the outside or something like that.
Blow in.
Potentially, that's right. But that's seen as being sort of, prohibitively expensive. It would involve removing all of the architraves and skirtings and cornices, and it's could have a lovely pressed metal ceiling or something. It sort of like has this knock-on effect. Other things could be the timber floor with the subfloor, especially if they're not doing any work in the existing building where they're not removing the floorboards.
But
or
this
not
is exactly the
restocking it.
intent of 233, isn't it? To exempt those parts out.
Yeah,
So,
But you're trying to achieve 7 stars. So if you were building that house as new today, and the extension
with that construction methodology.
the extension
not
is
changing
an
it.
insulated concrete slab. You'd put that into your theoretical file.
You would, but then the RBS has the
The
discretion.
correct, but I'm talking a case where even when you do all that, even when you insulate all the existing walls, even when you've upgraded all the windows to match the new part of the house and you still can't achieve 7, what's the alternative? Now, this is sort of giving you a get out of jail free card, but in my opinion, you'd need to change the Building Act in order for that to be applied. Yeah.
I agree.
They're going to be very rare. Now, I think I wrote a post on LinkedIn and I said that it was about 10%, but it's less. It's less than 10%. But the thing is, like, we hit a few of them straight up, which was just a bit odd, and that's why I thought the percentage was higher. But they still happen. Like I've had 3 or 4 of them since NCC 2022, and besides completely stripping the house, I sent one of the files to CSIRO and they couldn't even get it to work. So I don't know what combination of design, materials, whatever it was that wouldn't allow it to achieve 7, but it simply couldn't. So I'm wondering, do we need another clause? Do we need a change of the Act? What do we need in these circumstances? Because I don't think, Sean, you can do what it's asking you to do.
No, I don't believe we can. The backup for everything, which is usually a last resort, is building appeals board modification.
Yep.
Have you tried your luck with any of those?
Yeah, and it works, but I don't want to do that. Yeah.
Outside
because it's
that,
here.
we essentially can't just allow non-compliance where we have no discretion for it. The Building Appeals Board can, and they're essentially the only one that can where it doesn't fall within the RBS discretion.
Yeah, and there is enough justification to get it passed with the Building Appeals Board. That's fine, but obviously there's the cost involved in that. There's the delay. There's all sorts of unintended consequences with something like that. Now, if this paragraph is in the practice note, you'd expect there would be some methodology of utilising it, but again, don't think there can be.
If it had to go to the Building Appeals Board, it always works a lot easier if a building surveyor is supportive of the application. Would you support a reduced energy rating typically? Or what would it take to support it? At what limit would you say, no, you can keep going?
It's a good question, Andrew.
What's reasonable?
Yeah, it's a good question.
I mean, I'd have to look at it on its merits. To be honest, I haven't actually seen any recently where they've asked for that. Often a default position is no comments. Make the decision on your own, unless I do have a strong feeling one way or the other. But if an explanation was put to us and this is why we can't do it, and it all made sense to me and it was all practical, then I wouldn't. If I truly supported something, I wouldn't be hesitant to be supportive of that and say that I have no objection or support it. They still make their decision. Obviously, it gives a little bit of weight, but they still obviously make their decision either way.
But Brian, I'm just trying to understand what's your problem with this clause. It works for 90% of your projects and it doesn't work for 10. I don't see any difference between that and saying that a DTS deemed to satisfy using Elemental doesn't work for some projects and it does work for others. There are going to be different regulatory compliant pathways for different projects. It will work for some and it won't work for others.
No,
So,
it's more that just this paragraph, this clause within the practice note is impossible to work. It can't work because it's against the Building Act. Like you can't give dispensation on the new part of the house. You just can't do it.
It's not about the new part of the house. It's about the existing part of the house.
No, because
it's the overall house.
It's the single house rating method, rating only the renovated home. That renovated home needs to achieve 7 stars. If I go to the building surveyor and say, well, it achieves 6.5 stars, the building surveyor can't apply dispensation under Regulation 233 because they would have to apply it to the new part and the old part of the house, because I can't justify that I've got the house to 7 because it's 6.5 or 6.7 or
That's
something
only
like
because
that.
you can't get it to 7.
Correct.
If it's already at 7 for this particular
No, but-
clause, if it's already at 7,
I haven't got it to
It'll-
7. I can't get it to
Understand.
7.
it's only at 10% of your
No,
projects.
well,
The
it's,
other
it's less
90
than
that get to
correct, but
7
it's less
stars.
than it's
So you just
less
don't
than
use
10.
this particular clause for those 10%.
But none of the other methods work.
So you're after another method.
Well, I'm after some method to make this work. To make this less than 7 stars
Maybe
thing
it's
work.
missing a sentence saying, as a performance solution, you could get it to a reduced value, but you still got to do more. You've still got to demonstrate how you're meeting the performance requirements above and beyond that 6.5 stars with another method. Like, used to be a bit of a loose allowance of a water tank in ads and alts, which weren't a requirement. Is that meeting a fabric requirement of the performance requirements?
The issue is that you
Pushing
can't.
it.
Yeah, you can't put a performance solution together unless you can quantify what you're actually doing. Now, you cannot
Yeah.
quantify megajoules per meter squared with kilowatts versus liters of water. And that's the issue. You can't justify water against, kilowatts or megajoules. And that's the issue that I find with that type of thing. Now, we can't, because of whole of home, H6P2, we can't do anything with solar.
Yep.
So I can't double dip on the solar. So what am I left with? That's the issue. I think there needs to be some change to the Building Act to allow something like this, or you just go into the Building Appeals Board every single time. Now, granted, it's not going to be often, but it's something that's going to happen or does happen, something that does happen. But when you've exhausted all the other methodologies and then you still can't get it to comply, and it doesn't matter how many windows you rip out of the design, it still will not comply. What are you left with? You just can't build this house because the existing structure of the house is that detrimental to the energy report. You just can't get it to 7 stars.
I got to
No,
ask that.
you improve the existing building fabric with.
It's already upgraded to the maximum that you can possibly do. That's what I'm getting at. Everything's upgraded. And again, I've had this verified by Sustainability Victoria and by CSIRO on a few different occasions, and no one can get these things to 7 stars. So I need another option.
That sounds like a challenge.
I'll give it to
come
you.
on,
I'll
send
give
me
it to
the
you.
file.
I've got 2 of them I can give to you right now.
Is it a question of bad design, though? And I think that's partly where it comes into. If they change the design away from what they actually want, could it achieve 7 stars?
Neither of the ones that I am specifically thinking of, I felt were anything out of the ordinary. And that was the surprising part.
So
I thought,
reasonable
well,
plaster floor area ratios.
we deleted half the windows out and still couldn't get it to comply, and it wasn't overglazed
No.
really to begin with.
No,
Now,
hang on. Deleting half the
I know,
glazed area is not.
but hang on.
it's
I'm
not necessarily
talking
the
about
solution.
just
Depends on the orientation.
to try and find an issue with the file, and hence that's
okay.
why I went through the
okay.
processes
Bit
of
of
going
stress
to
testing.
CSIRO to see if there was a bug in the file, of which there wasn't. And that's how out of the ordinary this type of thing was. Now, again, we struck this quite early on into NCC 2022, so I thought it was going to be a bigger issue than it actually is. However, it is still an issue and people are going to face it depending on how many they do, or they might just get an odd one that doesn't work. But I'm happy to have you look at the file if you think you can make it work.
I'll do my best.
But it going back to this paragraph in the practice note, it's not practical. Like you can't use it.
I use it all the time.
What do you mean you use it all the time? You can't use it all the time.
Yeah, I do.
What, you get
All the projects to 7 stars.
no, I'm talking about when it can't
Less than
reach
7
7
stars.
stars. Matthew, I'm
All the
talking about when it
projects-
can't reach 7.
I understand. I'm using it all the time and getting them to 7 stars. I understand that there's a percentage that you can't. But, in most of the alterations and additions, unless they're the less than 25% where I'm using the formula, they're over the 50%, I'm using this one.
Okay, I'm
You're just
talking.
it's just
I'm
your
talking
10%.
about the ones. Well, it's less than 10, but I'm just talking about the ones that can't be done. That's what I'm talking about. Is this the clause? Is this the paragraph
I
that's
think you're
meant
after
to
something
cope
different.
cope with
You're-
those scenarios.
Your client base has projects that go to 7 stars easily. Our client base might not.
Yeah.
So, there are projects that exist. Like Brian, certainly not 10%, but I can think of, 2 projects in the past year. And I got asked a couple of weeks ago, so what does this mean? Are you saying that somebody can't do an extension to this house? And it was like, well, you can't do this extension to it. We might be able to come up with something, but it won't be what the client wants.
Mm.
There was a limit. It only went so far. I think this particular one was 6.2 stars, triple glazed.
Really?
140 mil stud. I had made allowances for changes to the design.
Mm-hmm.
I could not get it
Hang
anywhere.
on, triple glazing might be good for you, but it might be terrible with your SHGC. So I think
Well, I
it's
also
just
tried single glaze,
right.
double glaze, lower glaze.
Okay,
I mean,
all right.
I
Okay.
tried options.
We'll have a look at some of these projects. But Sean, I'm interested. We talk about a lot about what's reasonable, and nobody really quantifies what's reasonable. Everybody's version of what's reasonable is different. And, sometimes within the industry, we talk about sort of, do you have a good, RBS on that project, which is sort of like really interesting that there are sort of like good RBSs and what presumably there are not good RBSs. But I think what they're saying is sort of, the dial is, of reasonableness is varied, right? So,
Some might describe a building surveyor as good because they just let them do whatever they want.
Maybe.
So it's generally not where we try to set the bar. But we obviously try to be practical in our approach. So you have very common scenarios where in your greater than 50% scenario, you're asking about the scope of what are you doing here. So often the plans don't fully reflect it. It might look like they're keeping the whole part of the existing house, and in reality, you get there for inspection and all the plaster's stripped. And so we often even have some conditions or some clauses in our Reg 233 application that we get them to make to us that talks about what's practical. If you're removing plasterboard to a stud wall, we expect you to insulate it. Access to the roof space, if there's practical access to insulate. Similar to floors, obviously you're not expecting under a slab to be insulated if that's to remain. Like you talked about before, floors where there's access, where you might have practical access, and depending on what works they're doing. So also because we do find that plans don't 100% always reflect the scope, we do have a few extra things in there to discuss that. But people are usually somewhat receptive to that, and I don't think it's outside people's expectations as well. And they usually want to upgrade those things when you're doing an extensive renovation on your house. We're finding.
And I think what's important to understand about that is it actually has nothing to do with megajoules or kilowatts or star ratings, does it? It just actually really has to do with what can be done sort of practically, or whether there's actually any work that's actually occurring. I mean, you're not going to jackhammer up the concrete slab on ground just to put insulation under it, are you? So, no.
So the cost comes into it and what's practical. And like you said, with the double cavity, with the cavity brick walls, those kind of things are often looked at with some discretion. And it's probably an argument that you're not maintaining the 35 mil cavity that's required for weatherproofing and things like that as well if you're stretching into that area. And another area that that you can look at is, it's a bit mixed, but sometimes if we're getting into the whole of home territory and solar panel upgrades, often that's on people's radar while they're doing it.
I get asked that all the time.
Whether they do, some might want to do it less than others. You do also kind of have to factor in. There has been a few jobs where concerns are raised that an existing roof isn't structurally suitable to add that. So whether
Had
that
one of those
becomes a
recently
Reg
as well.
233 item. So I have seen councils issue, there's not many, but I've seen councils issue building notices to show cause why you installed that solar system, and they don't have any confirmation that, the trusses that were built 20 years ago were suitable to add this load, and they had to have, an engineer essentially assess it, tell council, we've assessed it, it's okay. But there is, the other factors that come into play with 233 being structural soundness, amenity, health, and costs as well.
I just want to segue for a moment. You just mentioned the 35 mil cavity, maintaining that. how does that work if you had a new double brick wall and it was somebody put insulation in it? How does that work for the 35mm cavity? If you put a foil centrally to the wall, does that impinge on the 35mm? If it was a solid board insulation, might be 30mm. Do you still need to then widen it out to have another 35mm?
Yeah, look, to be honest, we don't see that much cavity brick anymore. But
It's usually as a feature
every
wall
now
or
and then a
something like
feature
that.
wall. So the occasional, it's not obviously standard construction, but I'd normally interpret that you need to increase the cavity, use bigger brick ties to maintain that 35mm, because that is there as a, bricks aren't waterproof essentially, including specifically the mortar. Those walls, same as brick veneer, are designed to have that air gap, have any water that gets in, get out via weep holes. So if you had a rigid insulation board that took up the whole thing, I think it's compromising what that cavity's there to do.
So that would also apply if you were applying a blow-in retrospectively.
I think that could compromise it as well. Yeah.
So blow-in's almost non-compliant, effectively.
It could arguably make that wall non-compliant. Yeah.
Okay.
And rigid insulation also has its challenges because that can increase, the risk of condensation if you're not battening it out. And
And non-vapor permeable and everything else that goes with it.
That's right.
Then brickies don't exactly love it. No. Brick ties through every single
That too.
regular centre, and practically not always. Not
Yeah,
always
but
easy.
look, I mean, at the end of the day, we've got a double brick wall, or cavity brick wall. We need insulation in it. We can't, even as a short feature wall, it's very difficult to get away without. So, I suppose as assessors, we need to be conscious of that as well and be able to go back to a designer and say, well, you got to do this, but you're going to have to make it bigger. Then they'll kick up a fuss, but it's out of alignment.
Whether there's alternatives such as reverse brick or something like that too, if they're wanting the brick exposed internally. But
All right, so Andrew, I think there's actually a statement in the practice note that answers that exact question.